You know Dan Aykroyd, right?
Did you choose anything?
No.
Did you?
My mind is totally blank.
I didn't choose anything.
It just popped in there.
What? What just popped in there?
It's the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
Maybe he wasn't acting. Aliens, spirits, government surveillance. Dan Aykroyd's life is full of what goes bump in the night. This isn't just a regular story of a Hollywood legend. This is the story of a brave man who is seeking to find the truth of what's really out there. Because maybe Ghostbusters wasn't just a blockbuster film. Maybe Ghostbusters was a field report. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on the comedian, the actor, the phenomenal Dan Aykroyd. He is a true believer, and today we are diving into stories that explain maybe a little bit more as to what is out there and what Dan sees that maybe you don't. Yeah, if you thought that Ghostbusters was fiction, you better buckle up. And stay to the end because you will not believe what Dan Aykroyd's grandfather created in order to support ghostbusting. So if you don't know who he is, Dan Aykroyd is a Canadian actor, comedian, and screenwriter. He is a comedy legend known for Ghostbusters, The Blues Brothers, Saturday Night Live, and of course Coneheads, which is one of my favorite movies. But Dan's real life off camera involves the paranormal and UFOs, and his experiences are legendary. So we're going to dive into those today. Dan Aykroyd was born on July 1st, 1952, which is Canada Day here in Canada. He was born in Ottawa to his father, Samuel, who's also known as Peter Aykroyd, and his mother, Lorraine. Peter was a civil engineer and was a script writer for Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was our prime minister at the time. Peter Aykroyd is also the name of his brother, who was also an actor who tragically passed away. And Dan did study at Carleton University for criminology, but he ended up dropping out in order to pursue comedy, which I think is a benefit to us all. Let's talk about how ghost hunting is the Aykroyd family business, and I wish I was kidding. Dan was never just interested in the paranormal. It was like almost a religion to his family. It wasn't just the family hobby, it was a passion, and the family comes with receipts. We're talking seances, we're talking journals, we're talking ectoplasm, we're talking as much evidence as possible, and the stories they share are so compelling. So let's begin with Dan's great-grandfather. Dr. Samuel Aykroyd was a dentist in the Ottawa area, and starting in 1905, he was looking into an alternative method for his dentistry practice to help patients alleviate pain. He was looking into hypnotism, but that led him to an interesting discovery into spiritualism, which was all the rave back then. After his foray into spiritualism, he began hosting almost weekly sessions of seances at his farmhouse just outside of Ottawa. They had a room that they called the Circle Room, and in this room they would host a seance and try to connect with the other side. And it's possible that they might have done so. With the 83 journals that he left behind, he documented everything from objects flying across the room to the discovery of ectoplasm, and this inspired the rest of the Aykroyd family to continue to take up the torch. For nearly 30 years, these home circles were held like clockwork. People would drive up, and Dan Aykroyd's grandfather actually commented that he would see people come to the house in all black cars, whether that's true or not, because a kid might see something different, but they would pull up and they would host these seances behind closed doors. And one time when Maurice, the grandfather to Dan Aykroyd, which would be Samuel Sr.'s son, when he walked in the room, he saw a trumpet levitating in midair, and then it crashed to the ground, almost as if they had lost their concentration, and that loss of concentration caused the object to fall. But usually what was documented were disembodied voices, wisps in the air, and of course the sound of trumpets. In these near weekly seances, they would host regular spirit intervals, but 3 spirits would come through. The first was Mike Whalen, who was an Irish spirit that could come through at any time and discuss with the group. The second was a blue light that they called the Egyptian prince. The third was Li Long. Now, Li Long was a Chinese spirit that allegedly would possess Samuel Sr. and cause him to speak fluent Mandarin. Note, no one in the room actually spoke Mandarin, so how they concluded that he was actually speaking in Mandarin is a little bit contentious, but all three spirits were consistently coming through in these seances for 30 years. During his foray into spiritualism, Samuel met a man named Walter Ashurst, who was an acclaimed, quote, clairvoyant, who could speak to the spirits, and he actually ended up moving into the family home for 12 years while the seances continued. Samuel grew really frustrated towards the end of the seance sessions, and by 1933 he did pass away without ever tangibly seeing a manifestation of a full-bodied apparition. He saw a little bit of ectoplasm, he saw a little bit of wisps, he heard the voices, but he was never convinced that a full-bodied apparition was possible. And Walter said that a spirit had told them that it might never be so. Maurice, Dan Aykroyd's grandfather, having grown up seeing his father host these seances, continued to take up his father's torch of proving that ghosts were real and trying to get tangible evidence. This is where he invents a device where he can record the voices of the spirits and play it back to see what they would say. This, of course, would influence Dan later when writing the screenplay for Ghostbusters. Then, Dan's father, Peter, took the 83 journals and wrote a book called A History of Ghosts, which you can actually purchase today. Dan also helped to bring this book into fruition, but it chronicles all of the discoveries made by Samuel and is a great read if you're looking for something spooky to read before bed. I find it really interesting as well that Lorraine, who is Dan's mother, was truly a skeptic in the paranormal. She never believed that ghosts were real, but she recounts a few stories of living in the farmhouse and seeing spirits, specifically that of Dan's great-grandparents. They would often visit when she was nursing Dan and his brother cribside in the children's room. So this brings me to the idea that ghost hunting is not just a passion of Dan's, it's in his DNA. His entire bloodline has dedicated their lives to understanding what happens in the afterlife. What happens to our spirits that causes us to be ghosts, and how can we prove it? Here are some of Dan's personal stories about spirits he's witnessed in some chilling details. So I mentioned the farmhouse that Samuel has. Dan still owns it to this day, but when he was a child, he had a friend over and they were just wandering the halls. They noticed something very strange happening. There was this S-shaped wisp floating around the house. It didn't make a sound and it didn't really feel like anything, but they kept seeing this wisp floating through. Dan at first thought it was only him, but his friend mentioned that he also saw this S sort of wisp floating around the house. To Dan, he could explain this as a residual energy, maybe from all of the years of seances conjuring forth spirits. Maybe they never truly left, and sometimes they have just enough energy to show themselves in a little way. It may not be Samuel's dream of a full-bodied apparition, but an S-shaped wispy spirit, Dan will take it. Dan describes on multiple occasions laying in bed and feeling someone get in next to him. He explains it more clearly as the mattress dips next to him and he sort of just lays there. Now, he was questioned once by Joe Rogan as to why he didn't just like run from the room screaming, but he said he was more just interested to understand why that person was there and what they wanted. He ended up accidentally falling asleep and never really getting his answer, but on multiple occasions he has felt someone get in the bed next to him and then they just kind of fall asleep together. He likes to joke that it's his spirit with benefits. He also mentions that this happens in his LA home, which was the former home of singer Mama Cass, where he feels a spirit get into the bed next to him, but he's just sort of accepted that that's a part of his spooky life. And the house seems to be alive with some otherworldly energy. Doors open and close for no reason. There's chills in the room and the AC's not on. And as I mentioned, something climbs into bed with him, but his daughter experienced something very strange. She saw a red-haired man that looked like he was military, and he was walking at the end of the hallway. She explained him in full detail, and Of course, Dan believed her, but there was no explanation as to who this person was and why they were there. A guest staying at Dan's house, a former Army boxing champion, stated that he saw a black mass going up a staircase and up a wall, and he was terrified. He admitted later that it completely shook him, and Dan was really interested in the moment, but the guest was terrified. In the home, there was a Stairmaster, and at any given time, the Stairmaster would just start moving on its own. And if you know anything about a Stairmaster, like, it's really hard to push a Stairmaster. I know because I try to work out with it, and it's really hard. So whoever's there is just trying to get fit. There is also a local legend that someone died of a drug overdose in that home and it was buried somewhere on the property, though they can't substantiate it and they've never found a body. But it is said that the ghost of that person also lingers in this home. Dan doesn't say that anything in the home is evil, he just says that it's active, and it really does strengthen his belief that there is something going on the other side, because this house specifically has a high level of paranormal activity. Shortly after a close friend of his passed away, Dan started to notice an owl. And it wasn't just a normal acting owl, it seemed to stare at him, almost like it wanted to reassure him of its presence. And he strongly believes that it's a close friend of his that passed away and came back to him in owl form. He said that it would follow him in times of deep sorrow or when he was worrying about money, and he felt like it was his friend coming back to reassure him that everything was going to be okay. He felt very clearly that it was his friend saying, "I'm still here." This story I like to call the jewelry cyclone, and it involves Dan's wife. So one night, Dan and his wife were winding down to bed when something really bizarre happened. It was so small and strange that at first he didn't notice it, but it kind of defies all logic. On the nightstand next to their bed sat 2 bracelets. One pearl, one metal, undisturbed. Until, without warning, they started to spin in like a little tornado together, as if someone with invisible fingers was sort of playing with them. But the motion wasn't frantic, it was precise and graceful, almost playful. He and his wife just sort of watched it. They didn't really react to it, they just thought that it was interesting. They saw it together. He kind of felt like it was like a kinetic little wink from the other side. And it's not just his houses that Dan experiences the paranormal. He was staying in a Boston hotel. He said that when he walked into the room, something felt off and he couldn't put his finger on it. Now, after setting up the room for himself and tucking in for the night, he heard a strange noise, and when he went to check in the bathroom, all of his toiletries had been rearranged in a different configuration than he had put them. Not stolen, not trashed, just really carefully put in a different organization. Dan asked the staff if anything strange had ever happened in the hotel, and they admitted that there had been a maid that had died in the hotel, and ever since then, people have reported that their beds are being made, pillows being fluffed, and that their toiletries are being rearranged. Dan, obviously fascinated, other people probably terrifying. He found this moment uncanny, like it strengthens his belief every time he experiences something, but it was interesting for him that he walks in a hotel and sees something like this. The Chateau Marmont is one of Hollywood's most iconic hotels, and it's also the place where John Belushi, at the age of 33, passed away in 1982. John Belushi was a close friend to Dan and also his creative partner. Years later, Dan stayed at the same hotel in a bungalow, and this is the same bungalow that John actually passed away in. Unfortunately, he did not experience anything paranormal, but someone else did. Now, Dan didn't say the person's name, but he said a trusted source said that they had seen John Belushi's ghost in that room, hanging out in a place that they still loved. And to Dan, this was really heartwarming because this man was not only a close personal friend, he was family. And the loss of John Belushi at the age of 33 is still devastating to this day to everyone. Dan likes to hope that somewhere out there, his loved ones that have passed on are still there. And speaking of out there, let's talk about Dan and UFOs. Dan is a true believer in UFOs, and he's also had multiple experiences with them. His wildest story is him standing on the 23rd story of a building in Montreal. He sees what he can explain as a flying saucer that silently flies up. It's the size of a Macy's Day Parade balloon. It hovers there for a few minutes, not 50 feet from him. No noise, no sound, it just silently flies away. This was tangible evidence to him that perhaps extraterrestrials are real and they are visiting us, because it was too large and too silent to be anything conventionally earthbound. Dan is a proud member of MUFON, a mutual UFO network, and by the way, you can join them. I was looking at their website. MUFON is one of the world's most prominent UFO investigation service. It's a US-based nonprofit organization composed of civilians and volunteers who study and research compiling evidence to prove that aliens are real and they're visiting us. You can find chapters and representatives in over 43 countries. And in case you're wondering, Dan's status, I looked it up, he's a lifetime member. Dan also talks about Betty and Barney Hill and their experience with being abducted. He said specifically on the Joe Rogan podcast that he believes 100% that they were abducted by aliens. And Dan has met hundreds of alien abduction survivors. Some, he said, are like a spectrum. Some say that they, never want to hear about aliens again and that they're terrified. And others are like, man, I really want to get abducted again and go see them. He continues to go to conventions to talk to survivors and gather more information in typical Dan style. Gather more information that proves the thesis that aliens are real and that they're visiting us. He suspects that they're abducting us to understand us better, which is similar to something that I believe. I think they're trying to communicate with us, but they don't know how. So they're studying us in order to come up with a concept. But I feel like also we're the planet that they roll the windows up and lock the car doors when they drive by. Neil deGrasse Tyson and Dan Aykroyd together on Star Talk was one of the most fascinating episodes that I've ever listened to. So, Neil deGrasse Tyson is a skeptic. He does not believe in ghosts, and he does believe in aliens, but in a different way than Dan does. And they talked a lot about their spiritual beliefs. So Dan was the one that actually got me into the story of Flight 401, which was a plane crash that killed 100 people, 75 survived, and then people started seeing the ghosts of the captain and the flight engineer. Dan talks about that, so he shares the story. His position is that this is compelling evidence that ghosts are real because pieces of the plane were used in other planes, and then the other planes started experiencing paranormal phenomena. So he was explaining that he believes there's some kind of physics in objects holding residual energy, and that emotions and intense moments like that can cause a haunting and can be transferred to another object. Now, Eastern Airlines did pull all of the salvaged materials out of the new planes that they were reusing the salvaged materials out of, and the hauntings allegedly ceased. Dan also believes that all of those objects from the plane, they carry the residual energy, and that's why you see ghosts when you have old houses, haunted objects, and haunted places. Speaking on the scientific idea that Dan has about hauntings and paranormal, he says that we need to study scientific phenomena because there should be a DNA proof about the other side, the afterlife, wherever ghosts are. There's a fourth dimension that they're sitting in that's sort of bleeding into and connecting into our dimension. He would love to study DNA in ectoplasm. Reading his great-grandfather and grandfather's journals, he wanted to prove that ectoplasm is real, but it's very, very difficult to find ectoplasm. So if you get some, you call Dan Aykroyd. Dan wants science to catch up to faith when it comes to the paranormal, just like his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father believed, and his brother, that ghosts are real, we can prove it, and that full-bodied apparitions are hopefully possible. Obviously, Dan is influenced by his beliefs in his screenwriting, so we see it in the Blues Brothers, right? Like, the brothers hear this voice of God, per se, and they go on a mission together. Same thing with Coneheads. They're aliens that come to Earth. Hilarious movie. But then you see Ghostbusters, and that is where you see the journals coming in. Ectoplasm, a device that can not only speak to but trap the spirits, and of course the spirits being full-bodied apparitions that can physically affect this realm. So Dan lives in a world where this is not just fiction, it's real. He just has to prove it. Ghostbusters might not be fiction. Ghostbusters might be a manifestation. The Unbelievable explores UFOs, psychic animals, a flying lawnmower that killed someone, and delves into expressing how the paranormal might be possible. On top of his writing, Dan also has a penchant for entrepreneurship where he created Crystal Head Vodka. Now, this is not sponsored, but Dan, if you're listening, I'm open to a sponsorship for Crystal Head Vodka. There are now 4 different flavors that you can get. It's available in Canada and the US. It is literally a crystal skull of vodka. I'm going to show a picture. And it's inspired by the legend of the 13 skull. These skulls are said to have been discovered all around the world and are almost scientifically impossible in their creation. Like a lot of scientists have said, it's not really possible in the tools that we had during the time that allegedly the skulls were made. We didn't have the tools to make them, and even like rubbing would take hundreds of years. So the fact that the skulls are here, are tangible, scientists are skeptical. Dan is skeptical of most, but there are a couple of stories that Dan believes in when it comes to the crystal skulls. They are said to have spiritual powers, extraterrestrial energy, extraterrestrial messages, and psychic powers. Some people said that they have healing properties or that they can program your brain. All that to say, Dan was inspired and he created a no additive vodka based on a crystal skull, and I'm going to show the vodka bottle and the crystal skull, and you can see the inspiration there. Now, an artist actually wanted to model up the skull to see what the person's face would look like. Dan was really happy because the skull didn't look like him, and the skull also looked really happy, like it was a man smiling. I'll put a picture here. So they nicknamed this vodka brand Joy because that's what they saw in the man's face. So Dan's impact and legacy is, I can't thank him enough. We have Ghostbusters, we have Coneheads, we have the Blues Brothers, we have Saturday Night Live, but we also have a legacy of the journals, and he's sharing this with the rest of us. He's doing this with such bravery. He's challenging the norms of paranormal, not just to believe, but to look for proof and find the science behind are ghosts real and are aliens out there and watching us. He's putting his reputation on the line, but he's listening to people, he's sharing their stories, and he's looking into what's really out there, really trying to answer it, which I cannot say that for most people. He is helping to destigmatize the belief in UFOs and the paranormal through regular everyday pop culture. His legacy is that proof can be art, identity, and even a billion-dollar movie franchise. Whether you believe that his world is fact or fantasy, he's never been afraid to try. He's never been afraid to. My personal thanks to Dan Aykroyd. Thank you for everything you do. We believe in you, and we hope to see more from you in the future. Thank you so much for watching this. I really hope you enjoyed it. We've got more stories coming like this of icons, oddities, and so much more. You can also visit spookyfriendsclub.com for more spooky content, blogs, spooky finds, and also send us a note. If you want more deep dives into the strange and unusual, be sure to hit like and subscribe, ring the bell for your notifications. In the meantime, thank you so much for being a spooky friend. We hope to see you in the next one. And if someone asks you if you're a god, you say yes. So spooky.